We're going to take up a topic tonight that is a very serious topic and issue in our day. Statistics on suicide are horrendous, and not just in America, but everywhere. Everywhere I go in the world, it's a major issue right now. How many of you, by show of hands, know someone who either know someone directly or indirectly who has committed suicide? Look at that. That's almost everybody in this room. It's a major issue. And we're going to talk tonight about the 9 thieves of hope, and I'll explain why that is in just a moment. But when we look at the word hope in the dictionary, the Webster's 1828 says, hope is a desire of some good, accompanied with at least a slight expectation of obtaining it, or a belief that it is obtainable. Suicide by most every metric has reached epidemic levels. And it's estimated in 2017, which are the last published statistics that I could find, that suicide was the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. And, whoops, I didn't put the animations there for some reason. 10th leading cause of death in the U.S., but among people ages 10 to 34, it was the 2nd leading cause. Young people are committing suicides at a much higher rate than anybody else, 10 to 34. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We're going to cover this tonight, but the specific reasons do vary very widely based on each individual. But I would submit to you that the broader reason for the suicide level is because broadly of a loss of hope. People have lost hope. Remember the definition I read? A desire of some good, accompanied with at least a slight expectation of obtaining it, or a belief that it is obtainable. And we are in a climate where hope is being ripped away from people. Our children are being brainwashed into believing that we already are within 10 years of the end of the world. And if they're having other issues, why bother hanging around for the last of it? They have no hope going. It's ridiculous that we're at a place where a 16-year-old would go before the UN and say the type of things that were said recently, but it's because of a lack of hope. And it's not just in the climate area, it's in nearly every area. If you watch the news, I don't care what news channel it is, if you watch the news, they are actively trying to steal hope from you, I promise. It is all negative all the time. If you watch the regular mainstream news, everything that the current administration does is to destroy the world. And if you watch conservative news, everything everyone else is doing is to destroy the world. And it's like there is no middle ground. You're either destroying the world or your opponent is destroying the world. And it's like we're at this fevered pitch, to use a word that Brother Thomas recently learned. We are at this crescendo of crisis all the time. All the time. And there's no hope that it gets better. Honestly. What is the big hope politically? What is it? If you're on the left, the big hope is they impeach Donald Trump and somehow. And I hear that, I saw this. And if we impeach Donald Trump, it'll bring everyone together. Are you kidding me? That's about the dumbest, woo! Or if you're on the right, that Trump gets reelected and then everyone, no, it's not going to change a thing. It won't change a thing at all. It's going to be just as wacky and crazy. And we can look at all that, and any realist, will go, no hope. They say the optimist sees the glass half full. and the pessimist sees the glass half empty, right? And the opportunist drinks it while they're discussing it. There's a loss of hope. People have lost hope, that second statement, people have lost hope that things can get better. Hope that there's a purpose. Hope that what is better can be obtained by them. I'm not kidding. We are in a day where statistically in America, people have never been wealthier, ever, in the history of the world. In the history of the world, our poor people would be considered rich in much of the rest of the world. And historically, our poor people would be considered incredibly wealthy. But we're going around talking about how, horrible it is. Maybe you know someone, and obviously most of you know someone who's attempted or committed suicide. And I would not rule out the possibility that maybe even someone here tonight has considered that, or even may be considering that. And I want to speak to you today about hope. And some people may doubt that hope is possible, but I have confidence that it is available to us. And if you don't, I'd ask for a few minutes that you borrow my confidence if you lack your own. And I'm convinced that this world has made a serious, serious mistake. In an effort to rid ourselves of what some might consider as oppression, we have also gotten rid of that which provides hope. Some years ago, Western society set out to rid themselves of God, going as far as to declare God is dead. And they championed the idea that there was no God, and that those who believe in God were superstitious and they were weak. And as it was said by my brain has lost his name, but it's inconsequential because if he continues his current path, you won't remember him. But he said, religion is a fairy tale for those who are afraid of the dark. It's a fairy tale for those who are afraid of the dark. Well, what has embracing the darkness done for us? It's taken away hope. You see, every person, according to this secular ideology, is just supposed to stand on their own, and you'll never give an answer to some oppressive God. No one will ever judge you, and now you're free from all that restriction and all the confines of religion and the standards of the Bible, and you can pursue your own version of pleasure now. How's that working out for us? The problem is that in casting off God, we have also cast off any purpose for life. If there is no God, then there is no purpose for life. We're just a cosmic accident. There is ultimately no reason to live if there is no purpose ultimately for life, because if my life is just a blip that is going to only matter in maybe some historical book, if possible, that there's no God to stand before, there's no eternal after this, then what difference does it make? If we're just a cosmic accident, there's no reason to live. But I submit that those that profess such a thing are wrong. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of that here. That's not the point of the message tonight, but there's a significant reason. There is a significant reason to believe that there is a God, and that He is a personal God, and that He has a purpose for your life. I could submit to you my own testimony of belief, And we could also consider the multitudes of others who have found hope and purpose in God. And we could talk about that, and someone might say, yes, but just because a lot of people agree doesn't make it true. Well, I don't know. It seems to work for science nowadays. But I want to in like manner introduce you to the reality that God not only has given us a revelation to us individually, and if you're saved tonight, you have that witness within yourself. His Spirit bears witness with your spirit. But also the fact is that He's given us His Word. And while some would say, well, if there is no God, then the Bible isn't the Word of God, I would submit to you that the Bible explores and expresses a significant amount on the topic of suicide. And actually on virtually every topic, not virtually, on every topic that man deals with, the Bible talks about it and gives answers for it. So let's take a minute to consider that the Bible shows us specifically 7 men who committed suicide, 1 that intended to commit suicide, and 4 that expressed death wishes. That's pretty significant. About 12 individuals in the Bible that either committed suicide, attempted suicide, or wished to die. So that gives us a pretty broad spectrum of things. And in all of these instances, as I look at these, I find 9 reasons that people lose hope and consider suicide. Now, I want to explore for a few minutes, and I don't know that we'll get through all of these tonight, all right? So this may be a part 1, part 2. But I want to explore these reasons that are given in the Bible, because I think as we consider the reasons the Bible gives us, it'll help us to understand that God knows when we get to feeling certain ways. He's already expressed and recorded for us these thoughts and these attitudes to give us a point of understanding that He sees where we are. The Bible tells us that we don't have a high priest that's not touched with the feelings of our infirmities. And often what happens concerning suicide is people get to the point where they think, no one can understand where I'm at. No one can understand what I'm going through. And I want you to know tonight, God does understand. God does. And He's given us examples in the Word. It's interesting that the Bible not only addresses the fact of suicide, but the reasons people lose hope. And it gives us an answer to those things. So let's talk then about the 9 thieves of hope. And not all of them are up there, but we'll get through the ones we can get tonight. First of all is a loss of power. And I use the word power. It could be related to positional authority, or it could be related to other aspects of a person's power or abilities. But 4 times in the Bible, people committed suicide rather than being dispossessed of their position of authority or power. In Judges chapter number 9, turn over, we're going to look at all of these places just so you can see the illustrations here. In Judges chapter number 9, verse number 53 and 54. Judges 9, verse 53 and 54. It says, "And a certain woman cast a piece of millstone upon Abimelech's head, and all to break his skull." This was in the middle of a battle, and they were sieging a tower, and she threw a millstone over, and it landed on his head. He was the ruler of the people here. And it says, "Then he called hastily unto the young man, his armor-bearer, and said unto him, Draw thy sword and slay me, that men say not of me, a woman slew him. And his young man thrust him through, and he died." He said, I I don't mind dying. I just don't want a girl to kill me. And he requested or committed suicide in that manner. And you may say, well, he was terminal. Well, therein lies another reason people commit suicide, isn't it? He was going to die, or he at least thought he was going to die from it. All right? And now in Oregon and I think a few other states, doctor-assisted suicide is legal. Because when people think they're terminal, I want to die with dignity, that's what they say. Well, that's in essence what his statement was. Let me die with some dignity. Kill me with a sword. Don't let a girl with a rock kill me. So Abimelech would fall into this category. Look at Judges chapter number 16. Judges chapter number 16. Verse number 29 and 30 here. This is the account of Samson. And we know that Samson had been captured and he was in prison. His eyes had been put out. His hair had been cut. And he'd been made to grind the grain and so forth. They brought him out to mock him. And in verse number 29, Samson took hold of the two middle pillars upon which the house stood and on which it was borne up, of the one with his right hand, of the other with his left. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he, bowed himself with all his might. And the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people that were therein, so that the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. Samson died killing the Philistines, but he killed himself in doing so, and he knew he was going to kill himself. Instead of continuing in captivity, he committed suicide. Look at 1 Samuel chapter number 31. 1 Samuel chapter number 31. Verse number 3 to verse number 4. This is in the midst of the battle, and Saul is fighting. And it says in verse 3, the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through, and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And then his armor-bearer did the same. We'll talk about him in just a minute, but it says in verse 5, then his armor-bearer saw Saul was dead. He fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. And though we know this, that later another guy came by and gives the account to David that he came by and Saul was not dead and asked him to fall on him. So he did and finished killing him. So even being hit with an arrow and falling on his own sword to commit suicide didn't kill him. He was still alive, and he had to ask another person to finish the job and kill him instead of retreating or being captured by the enemy. Turn over to 1 Kings chapter number 16. 1 Kings chapter 16 and verse number 18. Here's a man by the name of Zimri. Zimri was a servant to Baasha, and Zimri went in and killed Baasha. He committed murder, and he thought to take the throne, and for just a short period of time, and it doesn't really tell us how long, he did assume the throne in the palace, but then the military heard that what he had done, and they decided to make the captain of the military the new king. And so the new king and the military came to kill Zimri for killing the previous king. Does that make sense? Sounds like a television drama, doesn't it? All right. Before there was television, there was the Bible. Amen. It's still more exciting. And in verse 18, it says, it came to pass, when Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the place of the king's house and burnt the king's house over him with fire and died. So Zimri commits suicide by arson in essence. So it's interesting, someone commits assisted suicide. Samson kills himself in vengeance against the Philistines, and the house falls on him. Saul falls on his own sword and then has someone else kill him and finish the job. And Zimri burns himself alive And oh man, that sounds just horrid. I don't want to die in any way, but I'm going to die somehow. But I promise you, I don't want it to be by fire. Wow. In each and every one of these situations, here's the situation. In each and every situation, the men had lost hope that they could either escape or that they would be able to be treated fairly, or that they could retain the position of authority that they had previously had. So instead of facing death at the hands of their enemies, they decided to kill themselves first. And all of these men were facing or had experienced that loss of that power or position in their own minds. They had lost hope that they could retain it. And they'd been kings or judges, and they feared because of the way they had treated others. Now listen to that statement. They feared because of the way they had treated others that they would be treated just as badly. And so they had lived without mercy, and they feared dying without mercy. Does that make sense? They feared being treated like they had treated others. If a person's experiencing that, then they need to experience what mercy and forgiveness are through Jesus Christ. What I'm saying is there are many times that people in positions of really great authority and power, not necessarily governmental positions, but I'm talking heads of corporations or very wealthy individuals, and they have been ruthless in getting themselves to that point. And when something comes out that's going to bring them down, many times they commit suicide. Why, I think it was in the news not too long ago. Jeffrey Epstein, who had violated and abused and hurt possibly hundreds of young women. And I understand the conspiracy theories and all of that type of stuff, but I would submit to you that he probably was a person that had great fear about how he was going to be treated in prison. So he killed himself. Because he had lost his power, his influence, his prestige, if you will. So this is one reason, one thief of hope. Let's talk about the second, and I think that's all we're going to get through tonight. A loss of or a lack of identity. We see an example of this when the Bible records that Saul's armor bearer committed suicide, and we read that verse just a moment ago in 1 Samuel 31 there. The Bible doesn't tell us his name. Now that's an interesting point, okay? The Bible never tells us his name, just Saul's armor bearer. And that's kind of an indication of the problem, if you will. This man didn't have his own identity. His identity was wrapped up in his relationship to Saul. That's who he was. Many people have allowed their own identities to be lost in the pursuit of someone else. I love my wife dearly. We just had our 26th anniversary yesterday. Woo! 26 years. We've had a wonderful life. And if something were to happen to me or my wife, and from my perspective, if something happened to my wife, it would be devastating. I have no doubt about that. It would be devastating. I love her with all my heart. 26 years of marriage, and just she is my best friend in the whole world. But can I submit to this reality? If we're not careful in that situation, we can lose our identity in someone else. And there are many instances where people's spouses have passed and they've had no personal identity any longer. and they've taken their own lives. If my wife was to pass, God forbid, my identity cannot be simply the husband of Angela so that when she passes, there's nothing left for me to live for. I have to have an identity that exceeds this relationship. This is the most important relationship on this planet. But I have to have an identity that exceeds this relationship, and she does also. And that identity has to be as a child of God. That identity has to be an heir of God and joint heir with Jesus Christ. That has to be the identity. When Abraham's wife Sarah died, Abraham sat down and grieved and wept and mourned for her. But the Bible says then after that, he stood up from his dead and he buried her out of his sight. And then he went on. Why? Because he just didn't love her. No, he loved her very much. He loved her. He'd been married way longer than Angela and I have. But he understood this, that his identity was not exclusively found in being the husband of Sarah. His identity was that he was the friend of God. And because his identity was beyond this world. See, if you put your identity in the things of this world, everything in this world is temporary. Everything in this world is going to end at some point. If your identity is in a person, no matter who it is, if it's in a friend, if it's in your parents, your siblings, your children, your spouse, or some other individual, if it's in your job, if it's in some possession that you have, everything in this world ends. Everything. The only place you can put your identity that will never end is in God. And that's where we ought to be putting our identity, that we are a child of God and an heir of God and joint heir with Jesus Christ. And so often what happens, as is in the case of this armor bearer, Saul died. Something happened to the one that his identity was wrapped up in. And because of that, he didn't have a secure identity of who he was individually, and he lost hope and said, if Saul's dead, there's no reason for me to live. I mean, think about that. If this person's dead, there's no reason now for me to live. This is probably a young person. But this probably wasn't an older person who would have had trouble, maybe carrying or being there. This was essentially his armor bearer would have also been kind of considered his personal security. So this is probably a young, strong, able-bodied warrior. And yet when Saul died, he took his own life. He said, who am I without this person? And unfortunately, many people come to that same mistaken idea. That they're no one without fill in the blank. And because of that, they commit or attempt suicide. Now, I would submit to you that the truth is that God has offered every single person a new identity in Jesus Christ. And it is available to you. It is available to you. It is available to anyone. I remember Brother Hayes sharing with me years ago. He shared this story in class numerous times, actually. I heard him share the story about counseling a lady who was a prostitute and a drug addict. And she was telling him about all the things that she had been involved in and all the problems that she had in her life. And he said, as she kind of came to the end of telling him, he said, I understand why you think your life isn't worth living. I understand it's miserable. You've convinced me it's miserable. I wouldn't want that life either. But the good news is, you don't have to have that life. God has a different life available to you. God has you don't have to have that identity. God has a different identity for you if you'll accept it. God's offered it to us. That identity that He offers is secure, it's reserved by God, and it's kept just for us. And it's necessary for someone in that situation. So we're talking about someone, we've talked about only two of the 9 here. We'll get to the rest starting next week. But 2, someone who's lost their position or their power, someone who has lost their identity, coming to that point of suicide. But I want you to remember this. God has an answer for both of those circumstances. He has an answer. And for everyone we'll talk about, He has an answer for it. And so we'll pick up next week at that place. Let's bow our heads tonight.